With development pressures, climate change and declining space for connectivity across the Greater Sydney Basin and beyond, there is an increasing need for restorationists, plant producers, planners and landscape architects to collaborate on ensuring natives of the correct provenance and genetics are conserved as well as planted within urban spaces.
I'd just like to introduce Paul Gibson-Roy. Paul has been involved in various aspects of the native vegetation restoration sector for many years. In that time he's worked with numerous groups and organisations to conserve our precious native biodiversity. He has been a driving force and the co-author of the soon-to-be-released Native Seed Sector Report, which he'll be talking about today. Thank you very much, Paul.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. This is a really exciting forum. It's a really important topic that we're here to talk about, and I'm very pleased to be a part of it. I'm talking about the Australian Seed Sector Survey. We ran this survey in late 2016, 2017. What we wanted to do was to go beyond what we often do in these sort of forums and workshops where you get little bits and pieces of feedback. We have a great discussion on a day, but often we have trouble quantifying what's happened across the whole broad sector. So what we wanted to look at is try and get some data on a range of sector-related subjects to the native seed collectors, to test some perceptions and uncertainties, what are people thinking about certain topics, and really to gather some knowledge on how and why and what processes our sector works under. So we broke the sector down into 4 groups. So there is some crossover between these, but what we ask people to do is to define the group where they spent most of their time working. And so people broke out into these 4 separate groups: seed collectors, seed production growers, people who grew seed purchasers, so people who bought seed for restoration projects, and then other users. Other users might be something like a university researcher or students and people like that. So essentially we asked a bunch of questions to each of those groups. Many of the questions were identical or worded slightly differently, so to encapsulate it. For a few groups like seed growers, there were different questions. Just a really little snapshot of how it broke out. The majority of people that responded were from the seed collection groups, smaller group of seed producers, which is not surprising, seed purchasers and seed other users. We got, interestingly and very happily, respondents from right across Australia, from the different states, but you can see there that New South Wales ACT was the most represented in our feedback, followed by Victoria, Western Australia. To some degree that might just reflect the size of the states, the economies, and also the fact that there is a lot of work going on in those states in terms of the native seed sector. What we found was that this is how the sector itself tends to break out. Remembering here, we're talking about native seed. Why all the people engaged in the use of native seed, how does this sort of break out? As you can see there, seed collectors, the blue group on the left, the majority of those are from commercial organisations. They see themselves as private operators, then NGOs and community groups. Seed collectors, seed growers, again, predominantly commercial growers, private growers, but also non-government organisations, and to a large degree as well, the second largest response from local and state government. So a lot of local land services, CMAs, groups like that, those agencies will set up little seed production areas. Seed purchases are largely coming from local or state government. Again, not a surprise. Most of our industry is supported by the public purse. Not totally, obviously, but the bulk is there. And then the seed users, you can see that. I'm going to really rush through a lot of these. I'm really just trying to provoke some thoughts for discussion during the day. What you can see here is we wanted to get a sense of the size of the sector. When we started doing this, we kept wanting to call it an industry. But really what we're finding is, we'll call it a sector, and we're probably doing it a service doing that. It's possibly more of a cottage industry. So you can see there in the blue again for the seed collectors, the bulk of those are sole operators, either part or full-time, or they operate in businesses which are less than 5 or 5 to 10 people. So these are small businesses collecting the seed or growing the seed. With the purchasers, the people who are buying the seed, they're predominantly coming from 5 to 10, again, not large operations, and then some you can find there at the larger end, 20 to 50 and 50 plus. What we're finding there from the feedback from the questionnaires was that a lot of those people are associated with larger organisations like a state government agency or something like that. So they're a small part within a larger organisation. We asked a whole bunch of questions about what issues are of concern to the sector, and we asked it to rank them, so from 0 to 5. Essentially, a 2.5 obviously is the mid-ground where, you know, it's neither an issue or not an issue. What we found was that all the questions we asked fell into, yes, it's an issue. But you can get a sense there, and I'll touch on these later in some of the slides, but these are the questions that people are finding a high concern about. So the future demand for seed will be difficult to meet from wild harvest. I think that's very important. Then equally important, the market is unwilling to pay for the true cost of seed. These are things that we're hearing often at these workshops, but we're able to quantify this here. We're getting this direct feedback. There is a lack of seed available from a broad range of species. Demand for seed is inconsistent. Seed orders are placed at too short a notice. You can read through those. Again, we'll touch on them. But these are all the things that are really pertinent to our sector, because if we're going to be restoring our landscapes, then these concerns have to be addressed. When we broke those concerns and we ranked from 1 to 3, out into those groups, you can see there, again, the seed collectors, the market, their number one concern is the market is unwilling to pay them for the time and the cost of actually producing or collecting that seed. They also think that seed orders are made at too short a notice, and again, that future demand will be difficult to meet from wild harvest. Again, for seed growers, you can see that you can read through them yourselves, but really, that really encapsulates a lot of the issues that probably are swirling around even in this group here today. A lot of that makes intuitive sense, but we've been able to quantify that across all the states. So these are a common set of concerns across our sector. So then we asked a whole bunch of other questions about how the sector itself operates. So where is seed used? And you can see there it breaks out. Again, just try and get the gist of these things. But essentially, the bulk of the seed is being used in what people put down as a category or defined as a category, biodiversity restoration and land care type projects. Again, perhaps not surprising because, again, the bulk of the money for restoration is coming from the public funding, so that would be linked to that. But what is equally interesting is that there are a range of other seed end uses going on there. So right through from carbon offsets, development, mining, even through to the native seed food sector. People were actually responding and saying, we are producing seed or collecting seed for those purposes. How much species diversity is required. Again, team was touching on ecological restoration, the need to bring to reconstruct complex communities. So we asked all the different groups what level of species diversity was either asked for by a client, or if you're putting together a project, how much were you're looking for there? And you can see that the bulk of the seed is being, or diversity is being required is less than 20 species, less than 50 species. There are some people saying that they're putting together projects at less than 100, and there is a tiny amount, I think that's 3% is something greater than 100. If we're talking about complex communities where we are talking about hundreds of species, then we're really not achieving that. Even though we're saying that the bulk of our restoration is going towards biodiversity restoration, what we're asking for is, or actually doing, is much less than that. seed collection practice. Do people collect to order, or do they collect on an opportunistic basis? We thought that was a pertinent question, and what we found there was essentially, and perhaps interestingly, a lot of seed collectors are collecting opportunistically, but there is quite a bit of seed collected to order. That probably surprised us when we were putting this together. So again, there is some forward ordering. Remember, one of the questions was, are seed purchases or orders made at too short a notice? Again, that would suggest that there is at least a reasonable amount being made, asked in advance. Seed origin. Here we're starting to get to some very interesting parts of the survey. You can see here the seed collectors, if you concentrate on that most of the seed is coming from private property, public roadsides and public reserves. Now again, back to Teen's point about fragmentation, those sites are where the populations are often small, genetically depauperate, so the bulk of our seed is coming from the least ideal in terms of genetics for the outcome that we're after, which is, genetically robust reconstruction. And the sites where potentially the largest and more genetically diverse populations might reside on state and national parks are not being accessed. So again, controversial, but do we need to open our minds to at least taking more genetic material from these more diverse settings? Seed licensing, again, an issue which is very pertinent, because if you don't have a license, then you are not entitled, or you shouldn't be collecting seed. Do you hold a current license from collectors and from purchasers? Do you require seed collectors to have a license? 60% say yes, they do, seed collectors. 50% of seed purchasers say we require you to have a license. But then there are a whole bunch who either don't have licences, don't require, aren't even sure if they need a licence, or just don't think it's applicable. So again, it's less than an ideal world. There's a lot more to this question than meets the eye there, but it does say that there is still a lot of uncertainty around permitting and collection. Seed supply and demand. We wanted to get a sense of, from the different types of plant types, where if seed supply and seed demand were matching each other. And again, seed collectors and seed demand, what we found was seed collectors were saying that the bulk of their trees, shrubs, grasses were at those ratios, but interestingly, the demand were very similar. So at this point in time, based on our survey responses, it looks like demand and supply are essentially meeting each other. This is something that we've always conjectured about. At least now we have some information about this. But this is, for mine, one of the most interesting findings from our survey. We asked how much you're actually collecting or how much you're actually asking for over an annual period. This is quite a busy graph, but please bear with me on this one. It breaks down into supply and demand for each of the different plant types. You can see there that 0, the blue graph, indicates that people aren't interested in that plant type. Then you can see the next graph, the next bar along, less than 5 kilos. What that's saying is that over the period of a year, that's how much we would use of that or collect it or ask people for purchasing it. The bulk of the seed for all the different plant types are either in the 0 or the less than 5 kilo amount. Now, there are some at the other end. There are some people producing larger amounts, up to a bit greater than 500 kilos. But the bulk of our responses are coming from less than 5 kilos or less than 10 kilos. So what this says is that even though supply and demand are matching each other, there isn't a lot of seed circulating for restoration or whatever in Australia at the moment. Now, even if that's out by a factor of 1 or 2 or 3 or even 10, there isn't a huge amount of seed either being collected or purchased. So what it means is that there isn't a huge amount of restoration going on. And this is the other very interesting one, a graph, I think, about collection and usage ranges. So where is the seed coming from? Teams show that side about the different provenancing strategies. Here we're getting some information about where seed is actually coming from. So seed collectors, where are you getting it from? Seed purchasers, where will you accept it from? You can see there that the bulk of tree seed is coming from 50, less than 100, less than 200 kilometres, less than 500. That's where the collections are coming from. Not less than 10, not less than 20. The bulk of collections are coming from quite distant geographic ranges. Exactly the same for the shrubs. Even more so for the grasses. And a similar thing for the wildflowers. So less than 50, less than 100, up to 200 for both collectors and the seed purchasers. So for many years at forums like this, we've got up and we've debated about it's really important that you're getting your seed from, as far as you can throw a stone from where you're restoring a site. But what our survey is telling us is that might be what we're all telling each other at surveys, at forums, but what we're actually doing is quite different. Now, it may be, because we're all very interested in the genetic health, it might be that we just can't get it locally and we'll go as far as we can to get it. It might also be that people are selling seed quite cheaply from 400 kilometres away, and it's just the market at work here. It's probably a combination of all those things. But again, we've got some great data here to show that seed collection, seed usage, seed demand, people aren't focusing on the local. They are prepared to accept a whole bunch beyond that. Now, that might make a lot of people uncomfortable, but I don't know. But that's what we've found. I think that's really interesting. Seed testing. It's the fundamental unit of what we're doing, either propagation or direct seeding. But seed quality. Do we know what the quality of the seed is that we're actually using in our projects? Are we throwing out seed or propagating seed that is of any use? And we find seed testing. Do people who are requiring seed, do you ask for test results? Yes, and would you pay for it? Only 40% require seed testing information and would pay for that. So that comes back to that, they're not willing to pay the true cost. Yes, but I would not pay extra. Again, even more so. The cost of seed at about $200 per test builds up very much. If you're only selling small amounts of seed, remember all those seed lots are less than 5 kilos, less than 10, and $200 a test, it becomes uneconomic. Seed practice. The seed collectors, do you provide seed testing information? So 70% of seed collectors say no, they don't. A larger proportion of seed growers do. But again, we don't have industry standards around this. There is no requirement for us to supply labelled information about independent testing or even internal testing like in other jurisdictions like North America, where that's just a fundamental basis of their seed industry. Now, they've got a market which is large enough to support that. Here, if people aren't recouping the cost of even collecting the seed, how are they going to get the cost of testing? So just a few slides here about seed production, because that's going to be one of the factors where we can get diversity in seed. That seems to be the breakdown at the moment of how seed production is set up. It's mostly field crops. They're all generally small. So seed production in Australia is quite small. We don't have any large seed producers up around the 30 to 100 hectares. The footprints of seed production areas are really broken down to mainly grasses and non-woody wildflowers at the moment. And again, the diversity, this issue around diversity. The diversity in our seed production areas at the moment isn't particularly high. So we're really focusing on a narrow suite of species. Just some other issues raised by respondents that really came out. A lot of people spoke about volunteer labour and its importance, but also its potential disadvantaging organisations who don't get the value of volunteers. And that could be land care groups, NGOs and government agencies. So that was an issue. A lot of people voice concerned about forums like this. Now, I think this is a great forum in the sense that it's really about practitioners, but often what you get at forums is very much a focus on either agencies reporting on projects or academics talking about particular projects. No disrespect to any of those people, they're often lovely and they're great presentations, but a lot of people in the sector found that they weren't getting a say in these things, that the forums were often very expensive. They were held at times when people are either out collecting seed or wanting to do their projects. So there's this mismatch between the doing and the agencies and potentially the academic and research people. And again, the high cost. So here's our key findings. The future demand is difficult to meet. There's not enough available from a broad range of species. We need an industry group, and you can look at those yourself. But really, I think that sets the tone for this forum, because all these issues are relevant to Sydney. The Sydney market has the airport, the conservation plan, all the infrastructure around the airport. There is a huge need for seed in Sydney. And if all these issues are relevant to Sydney, which they are, then where are we going to get that seed? Thank you.